Good morning, evening or afternoon. My name is Tony Kirkham. In the first video I provided an overview of Zero Trust, its purpose and objectives. In the second video I provided a slightly deeper look at the architectural approaches. In this video I'm going to provide some deployment guidance. Firstly, given that every organisation is different business models, risk profiles, different IT and application architectures, size, scale, maturity and operational models, etc., it's difficult to provide a one-size-fits-all approach. But I will go through a number of questions to ask, several deployment considerations, and provide some possible ways to deal with those. I will also go over a general methodology originally provided by Forrester and expand on that approach. So hopefully this information will help people take an initiative forward. Through this, we will keep the overall goal in mind. Zero Trust is a set of principles leading to an environment where open trust relationships have been either eliminated, reduced or minimised. Let me start with some questions to ask. As I mentioned in my first video, the key issue here is protecting the data. So do we understand the business risk in the event that data was compromised, stolen, maliciously released or ransomwared? The reason I ask this is that it will be very difficult to get business level support without being able to articulate the risk. So it's crucial to have an appropriate executive sponsorship for any of these initiatives. Secondly, can you build or afford to build a new greenfield environment? Or do you need to improve on what you have? It is a lot easier to build a new environment than to try to redesign or retrofit to an existing production environment on the fly. But for many, it may be the latter. A third question, what type of architectural environment needs to be addressed? Is it users accessing applications, or is it restricting application endpoint access to other application endpoints, like databases? That's a fairly individual question, which will vary from organisation to organisation. A fourth thing to consider is opportunities. Is there another initiative on which you could piggyback? For instance, a good time to pursue a Zero Trust initiative may be when doing a cloud migration. This may allow a new security architecture to be incorporated. It's something to think about. It is also important to understand the constraints you will need to work within. The first is economic constraints. These things cost money, both capital expenditure and operational expenditure. And as I mentioned above, you will have more chance of getting project budgets if you understand and can articulate the business risks. Also understand some current environments are very costly to operate, so a simplification strategy can be a big win. What are the availability requirements? Can we get appropriate outages to perform re-implementation work? Or is the environment so mission critical a new parallel infrastructure needs to be built as well? Third is, what is the real state of the existing environment? Is it reasonably well organised, well documented and in a healthy operational condition? Or is it a huge mess and has had a long series of short-lived systems administrators, for example? If it's in a bad state, and I've seen many of these, can it even be cleaned up? Before we go further, I just want to review 4 principles that I regard as very foundational in any Zero Trust initiative. The first is it needs to be a data-centric approach. The second is the protect surface needs to be as close to the data assets as possible. We need to integrate a strong identity capability, and we have to manage the complexity. Let me now show you the process which was originally proposed by Forrester. My perspective is that all the key things are there, but I want to expand on it, so let me go through it. Taking an inventory of your sensitive data and deciding how to segment it. The second step was mapping the traffic flows of your sensitive data and associate them to your business applications. Step 3, designing and enforcing your network's microperimeters. Step 4, ensuring all your security ecosystems integrate so you can holistically monitor and adjust your network if threats are detected. And the fifth is embracing security automation and orchestration for long-term success. What I want to do now is provide an expanded version based on that original Forrester process. Now this is purely based on my experience in these type of initiatives. So step 1A, taking an inventory of your sensitive data. So this is absolutely the first step. Next, it's important to understand the risk associated with each of those data assets. So I would suggest to, as a step 1B, risk score the data and the systems on which it resides. Not all data will be equally sensitive, so understanding that is important. And also understanding what type of system does it reside on. Is it on a recent and well-patched operating system, or something like Server 2003, which has not been patched in a decade? And believe me, these things do still exist. Then based on that assessment, decide how to isolate it. And I'll use the term isolate at this point because we want to understand that data repositories need to be kept separated from each other. For example, what part of the organisation uses that data? For example, the finance system, say, and the engineering repositories probably have very different groups accessing them. So there is probably a very strong case to keep them isolated. If we look at step 2, then that is mapping the traffic flows of your sensitive data and associate them to your business applications. Now this one is very important for a few reasons. Say the sensitive data might reside in a database. However, multiple other systems in the application architecture may transact with that database, meaning there could be multiple points of access to that sensitive data. So let me go through a simple example to illustrate the issue. This is a simplistic 3-tier application. Let's assume that the users interact with the web server, and it's behind a firewall, or preferably a stateless access control list due to the DDoS risk on the firewall. But this in turn interacts with an application server running some kind of middleware, which in turn interacts with a database which contains some valuable or sensitive data. So for this example, let's assume the web tier was vulnerable to something like an Apache Struts CVE. Someone externally compromises and owns that web server. They download and install some attack tools, which then allows them to scan and perform general internal reconnaissance. They find the database and are able to connect to it and able to do bulk interrogation. Then they exfiltrate some data out of the organisation. So there's no surprises there. My key point is if you want to restrict or do deep inspection of the transaction flows, you need to understand them. This in practice may be easier said than done. In practice, things are typically far more complex than this example. So I have worked on a number of system designs and in many cases found that the application team have little idea of the transaction flows. Or in an existing environment, often the people who built it are long gone and much of this stuff is completely undocumented. In these cases, the tooling and approaches to building that understanding is critical. So I'll talk about that more later. But back to this slide, if we use a firewall between tiers, it makes it much harder for an attack to propagate if the access is strictly limited to just the required transaction flows. Or, of course, the same thing could be done with a 5-tuple host-based firewall rule. But before I move off this example, I just want to point out the importance of the overall architecture. So if we take this example, the architecture is very similar to the first 3-tier example. But this one just uses a direct connection from the web tier to the database. So if we have a compromise of that front-end web server, then the miscreant can potentially get direct access through that open port, say 1521. So I would regard that as a fundamentally flawed architecture. Even if it was locked away in some secure enclave, that one open port could be an easy vector for the data to be accessed and exfiltrated. So yes, you could put some compensating controls around it, but my point is to understand the transaction flows and how they could be potentially misused. Let's move on to the third point now, which I'm going to expand into 3 parts. Step 3A is designing and enforcing your network's microperimeters or enclave architecture. Step 3B is selecting and designing the most appropriate access architecture. And step 3C is the integration of the identity systems. So let's start with designing and enforcing your network's microperimeters or enclave architectures. So firstly, this is fundamentally a segmentation exercise. How we ensure critical systems are appropriately isolated from each other, and not just each other, but also other systems like IoT devices that could be intrusion vectors. And while it is not easy, this is why understanding the transaction and traffic flows is so important. Generally, there are a couple of common architectural approaches: enclaves or microperimeters. An enclave is usually a security zone with a single ingress and egress point through a next-generation firewall. It usually holds a group of devices with a similar security affinity. But as I mentioned previously, relocating to an enclave may mean readdressing, so there are some practical considerations there. Or you could go and place a microperimeter around each individual system. The most obvious is the use of a centrally orchestrated host firewall-based approach, something like Cisco Tetration or the Illumio solution. These are all considerations that need to be worked through in the design process. These two are not the only ways, but probably the most common. Now, the architecture example I went through earlier was quite simplistic. In reality, the traffic flows which occur in reality are a lot more complex. This is a chord diagram. Around the circumference are the application endpoints, and in the middle are the network traffic flows which are occurring between those application endpoints. So this is a more real-world scenario. But it's probably a small subsystem of a much larger environment, as when I look at this, I count around 80 endpoints in this particular system. My point here is to show the complexity that's involved, which then leads into talking about the various segmentation approaches and the tooling. So in developing an effective and even remotely optimal segmentation structure, you need to understand the network traffic, as I discussed in step 2, application stack and transaction flows. There are a number of ways this can be done, but let me talk about 3. You can use a next-gen firewall and start with an open security posture and progressively close it up until you're confident that you've captured all of the flows and it's going to operate as you intend. This approach works, but it tends to be limited to smaller and simpler environments. A second approach which can be used is collecting and analysing firewall logs. Again, in a smaller environment with limited budgets or resources, this approach can be used. But again, it may mean placing or using an existing firewall, preferably a next-gen firewall, in front of some asset or assets to get the visibility into the traffic information. While it can work in these smaller situations, it can be a very manual and potentially error-prone approach. But there are some firewall rule analysis tools which can help. These are things like AlgoSec, Tufin, FireMon, or if you're really keen, you can roll your own using scripting and regexes to do the analysis. But as I say, these approaches are far from perfect, but in the absence of anything else, they can work okay. But there are better approaches and tools available. The second approach I'll talk about is the use of flow analysis. By that I mean NetFlow, SFlow, IPFix, and those sort of protocols. Basically, they work like a call detail record in a telephony scenario. You record who spoke to who, the duration, etc., but not the contents. So basically a flow is a unidirectional concept which fundamentally records the source, destination, protocol and ports, etc. And these can be collected and analysed. And the approach generally scales very well, and that's one of the key strengths of it. So note that there are different flavours of NetFlow, including both sampled and full flow. For security applications, you need to collect full flow information. And there will definitely be some hardware platform dependencies there. So you will need to ensure that it can be collected. You will also need to ensure it can be collected at one or more suitable points in the network to allow you to assemble a suitable picture. In terms of products, there are a number, but I'll mention 3. There's Cisco Tetration, Illumio and vArmor, and all have different capabilities and sit at different price points. Tetration and Illumio can both do the visualization piece and use application endpoint agents to gain the visibility. Both of those can do the enforcement piece as well. vArmor is an agentless system which is purely focused on the visualization and analysis and then subsequently producing the security policies. I previously mentioned the use of flow-based approaches, so let's quickly look at what this looks like at a network level. In the leftmost diagram, we have the most common approach, a layer 3 switch, a router, a firewall, or virtualized versions of any of those, exporting NetFlow or IPFix to a collector for analysis. In the middle, we may have a scenario where the infrastructure may not have the required NetFlow functionality, for example, full flow NetFlow capability. So we could use a span port and some sort of a NetFlow generator, or a network tap and a NetFlow generator. So there's a number of those on the markets. One that comes to mind is products from Gigamon. Then in the rightmost diagram, we have an agent on a server, or in a VM or container, exporting flow information directly. So this approach can also capture internal information like the process that initiated each flow. But that comes at the impact and the deployment cost of an agent and potentially producing a lot more traffic. The heart of the problem is either constructing an optimal security zone structure, which may mean re-engineering the current environment, or creating whitelist ACLs for each application endpoint. To get there, you need to be able to visualize the application relationships as some sort of a graph. There are some different names here. Application dependency mapping is a term that comes from Cisco Tetration. Application group mapping is a term that comes out of Illumio. And application relationship management is a term that comes out of vArmor. So from there, it's really a design process. You need to consider the risk profile each of those systems in developing the relevant security policies, be they for something like a next-gen firewall or host-based ACLs. To illustrate this point, this is an illustration of an application dependency map taken from Cisco's Tetration. You can see that even in a fairly small environment, the traffic flows quickly get quite involved. This is an illustration of an application relationship map taken from vArmor. There's 3 slides here, just to give you an example of the types of things that you can see when you're trying to visualize these application relationships. I want to come back to the expanded version of the process. What I want to say is that the process isn't to follow a bouncing ball. A number of the steps are likely to require a few iterations before you get to an optimal structure. So I would suggest just get a first pass done and then go through and refine it from there. The next consideration becomes the access architecture. So a question, is this an environment where the users internally access some system within an internal data center? Or is this system located in, say, a public cloud, and you need to consider something like software-defined perimeters or identity proxies, which I talked about in the last video? That's a design decision that you'll have to consider. So these decisions are normally very organisationally specific. It also plays into the identity design that you'll intend to use. Then the final consideration in this third step is the integration with identity systems, and this is a sizable topic in itself. The key goal here is to ensure access is only granted to fully verified individuals. So single sign-on should be a big part of any solution, the purpose of which avoiding the frustration of multiple logins for your users. Multi-factor authentication. Its purpose is to robustly establish the identity of users so you have a high level of trust in their identity. As I have mentioned previously, now it's absolutely critical for admin and privileged accounts. Some of the products in this space, Cisco Duo, Okta, Ping Identity, etc. Beyond multi-factor authentication, the access process itself should also consider additional parameters of the user and their devices. Where are they logging in from? What's their device type? What's their device posture, etc. And it should continually monitor those parameters. Within a data center or cloud, you may need to consider machine identity approaches when you have application endpoints talking to other application endpoints. From a deployment perspective, I would strongly recommend to secure the identity systems first, because if these are compromised, it can be game over. The security of the identity systems like AD, Red Hat Identity Manager, etc. is really paramount. I know this is quite high level, but there are many different potential combinations in the identity domain. I want to jump back to the original Forrester process and look at the final two steps at a high level. Ensuring all your security ecosystem integrates so you can holistically monitor and adjust your network if threats are detected. There are three key points in this statement. The solution should be seen as an ecosystem with integration between the elements. Each of these integration points can become an additional operational capability. This leads us on to a holistic monitoring capability, particularly when additional context comes into the monitoring. If you have an identity context in addition to connection logs, this is something meaningful to a human. Then the solution becomes far more powerful than just, say, a series of log messages with IP addresses. For example, why is the laser printer in engineering talking to Iran? So this is all about continual improvement and operational capability of the solution. These days it's not just about preventative architecture. The threat landscape is too fast changing. Threat detection can be hard, particularly for more advanced threats. So you must assume at some point you will get a breach and you will need to detect and respond. And over time, requirements can change and the solution, and particularly the segmentation approach, needs to keep up. So this type of visibility helps with that process. The final step of the Forrester process, step 5, embracing security automation and orchestration for long-term success. Today, relying on a manual process is not going to be sufficient. The tooling and the ability to automate particularly repetitive operations is necessary. We continually see security staff who are not effective at the stuff that counts because they are so overwhelmed with things like the sheer volume of alerts and other noise. So there are many tools which can help in this respect. So managing and automating tedious and error-prone tasks like security policies is one of the most important in a Zero Trust initiative. So there is certainly a lot more I can say, particularly on the last 2 points, but I will have to leave it there for now. As these videos do take considerable time to produce, any comments or likes are greatly appreciated. Thank you. I hope this has been worthwhile.